Welcome back to Askewed Reviews, and this week we are doing the Indiana Jones franchise, and today we are doing the 1984 action-adventure film, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Here is your trivia question for today. What is the name of the club at the beginning of the movie in Shanghai? The answer will be at the end of this video. So our movie starts off in Shanghai in 1935, and we join our adventuring archaeologist, Indiana Jones. You see, Indiana is after a particular diamond that he's trying to get his hands on. Lao Che, who is a crime boss, has this diamond and is willing to make a trade for it. Now, in the middle of making this exchange, Indiana also happens to meet a woman named Willie, short for Wilhelmina. Now, of course, all hell breaks loose, so Indiana and Willie have to run for their lives. The two of them are able to escape thanks to the help of Indiana's sidekick, Short Round. Then all three of them manage to escape in an airplane. Then, of course, things don't go so well there either. Eventually, the three of them are safe and end up in a small village in India. While in the village, they are told about how their sacred stone and all of their children have been stolen by the local palace. Indiana, of course, decides to look into this, and the three of them head off to Pankot Palace. For the most part, everything at the palace seems pretty normal, other than the cuisine. They meet the Maharaja, who invites them to stay for the evening. But, of course, these three can't help but snoop around. They end up in some traps, stumble upon a secret cult meeting, and finding a bunch of enslaved children. Oh, and of course, this guy, Mola Ram, is in charge of all of it. And in the end, they end up discovering that there's not just one, but three of these sacred stones. Now, in the end, will Indy and his team be in possession of the stones? Or will Mola Ram finish his nefarious plans? This is, of course, the second Indiana Jones film that Steven Spielberg and George Lucas have worked on together. Now, they and a lot of other people have stated that this film is a lot darker than the first one. Probably because George Lucas was dealing with divorce at the time, and Steven Spielberg had just left his girlfriend. So, this may be why you see sequences of hearts being ripped out and stuff like that. Now, it's actually due to the violence in this film and the movie Gremlins that they created the PG-13 rating. Now, the film does take place in India, but they weren't actually allowed to record there, so most of the film is actually filmed in Sri Lanka. Here's something not everyone is aware of with this film. It is actually a prequel that takes place a year before the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark. One of the original concepts they had for the sequel was to actually bring Marion back into it, but that didn't pan out. I'm sorry, that was bad. But seriously, they decided to end up going the James Bond route by having a different female in each movie. Willie is in fact supposed to be the exact opposite of Marion. In fact, Kate Capshaw said that she really was very critical of the character, as she felt at times that she was just a dumb, screaming blonde. Here are some interesting concepts that thankfully George Lucas did not end up putting into the sequel. His original concept for Indy's sidekick was, as he described, a virginal young princess. But everyone else disliked this idea, and I am very worried about whether or not that sidekick was supposed to be Short Round, or whether or not it was supposed to be Willie. Another original concept that Lucas had for the sequel was Indiana discovering a lost world in a valley that held dinosaurs. Apparently, Chris Columbus even submitted a script for the sequel. In this one, Indiana would have been going to Africa, where he would have faced off against a monkey prince. Apparently, they just felt it was a little too stereotypical and possibly a bit too racist. However, though, there was actually a tank chase in the script that they ended up taking the concept of and putting into The Last Crusade. So in this film, it's not just Indiana who's named after George Lucas's dog. Willie actually comes from Steven Spielberg's dog, and Short Round actually comes from William Hike's dog. Kate Capshaw plays the character of Willie Scott in this film, but there was apparently over 120 actresses that tried out for the role. The only other named actress I've heard so far that tried out was Sharon Stone. Capshaw was very proud of the fact that that was actually her singing at the beginning of the film. Now, in case you were wondering whatever happened to Willie Scott, apparently in the original script for the movie Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Indiana was going to reveal that Willie Scott actually got married to some big shot director, which is pretty funny as Kate Capshaw actually got married to Steven Spielberg. Ke Huy Quan does such a great job as the character of Short Round in this film. In fact, this was his feature film. His brother was the one who was originally auditioning for the role, but during the audition process, he kept telling his brother what to do and what he needed to do. So when they noticed this, they asked him to audition as well, and of course, he got the role. In fact, he beat out 6,000 other kids for the role of Short Round. As I mentioned earlier, they got the name Short Round from screenwriter William Hike's dog, but William Hike actually got the name from the film The Steel Helmet, which another character has the name of Short Round. By the way, if you don't know, Short Round's real name is actually Juan Lee. I have also heard, unfortunately, Short Round is probably not going to show up in the Dial of Destiny, but there is an interesting reference book called The Lost Journals of Indiana Jones, where it mentions that Short Round grows up to be an adventurer and is trying to seek an artifact called the Peacock's Eye. What's really fascinating is that particular artifact has a very long history in this series. For instance, that's actually the diamond that Indiana Jones is holding at the beginning of this film. And in the Young Adventures of Indiana Jones, there's a made for TV movie called The Treasure of the Peacock's Eye. Amrish Puri did a great job as Mola Ram in this film. In fact, he shaved his head to look more villainous. It apparently did a good job, as he got many, many more roles in lots of Bollywood movies as a villain for quite some time afterwards. Something else that's just kind of interesting, Amrish in this film obviously looks a lot like Dalzim from the Street Fighter video game series, but his co-star, Roshan Seth, actually did appear as Dalzim in the Street Fighter live-action film. Dr. Nene Yakara, who was actually the shaman in this film, did not speak any English and had to just phonetically deliver his lines. Pat Roach, who appeared as a few characters in Raiders of the Lost Ark, actually came back to play the large thug in this film. Dan Aykroyd actually has a small cameo in this film, as he's the one helping Indiana, Short Round, and Willie get onto the plane. In fact, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas actually have small cameos as missionaries in the background of the airport scene. The rope bridge scene was actually filmed in 3 different locations. When they were actually on the bridge, that was in Sri Lanka. When the bridge was broken, that was actually in England at the L Street Studios. And when they showed the alligators eating everyone, that was actually filmed in Florida. Did you happen to notice when the floor opens up before Willie is lowered, it actually makes the same sound that a lightsaber does when it powers up? Both Indy running behind a gong while being shot at and the minecart scenes were originally written for Raiders of the Lost Ark, but they decided to cut out both of those scenes. Obviously, they came back for this film, though. The sounds of the minecarts moving around were actually recorded from the Big Thunder Mountain Railroad roller coaster in the Disney theme parks. The very odd dinner that our heroes are presented with is actually inspired by a dinner Spielberg had when visiting India. This film is very entertaining to watch, and I'm sure if you're the same age as me, or at least around the same age, you probably said Kali Ma while pretending to rip out your friends' hearts. Now, the film, of course, did have a much darker tone than the first one, but it was still very enjoyable. So I'm going to give this movie a 4 out of 5. As for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, what is the name of the club at the beginning of the movie in Shanghai? The club was called Club Obi-Wan, which is definitely a reference to George Lucas's character that was played by Alec Guinness and eventually Ewan McGregor. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments. And as always, like, comment, share, and subscribe.